Good evening, everyone. Welcome to another Feeling Thursday Lounge with the 2MK team. This is our EU lounge, even though technically, if you're looking at connections, I'm the one who made the lounge. I don't remember why we do this, and I'll look into it again later. But you can generally expect to be encountering at least one EU player and people who should have good connections to EU players if you join in. Today I am once again hit by the horrors of... Hey, what's broken here? Oh, nothing. Allergies, mostly. I like this strange plateau, so let's rock it.
Nothing will stop this show.
Today, therefore, I may have less to say, especially if we don't get a lot of joiners outside of team members. But KOF matches tend to last so long, especially if you actually take the rematch, that we tend to only get 4 into our usual 1-hour streams.
You. Round 1. Ready? Go!
I don't necessarily have a lot to say about this character because Geese is just Geese. Like, if you've ever played this game before and you understand anything about Geese, you can't really do anything to him. He's just a type of character you can't really hurt, per se. Or rather, the standard, you don't get a choice in whether or not you do that. One of the main things I think that makes him stronger in this game is that it's actually harder to react to him attempting a parry. And of course, because he has good advancing moves, he can just stand at the spot where you want to hit him for doing those moves, and then parry you. Here's my hard matchup now. Yep. Fortunately, Ralph's relatively slower walk speed and tendency to not do that terribly well if he has to run mean that Shermie can look for openings that don't exist in normal matches. This, on the other hand, doesn't involve those types of openings. You have to bet a lot harder here to figure out whether or not you're going to be in the right space. So weaving through Whip's attacks can be much more difficult. Geese fits into the other half of my playstyle, basically just getting to stand there and the opponent not being sure what to do. In this case though, I am facing someone who will mostly ignore this, and it's good practice for me to have that person who will mostly ignore it. Though it's harder on her side as she will just end up getting kicked in the head or something repeatedly. Okay, that one's the setup one. Fortunately, this also means that the parry itself is shorter, which I think was a good choice to make. They've been making a lot of changes to characters in this game to make them more reasonable to play for long periods, or in, let's say, a tournament, like when you're not all that familiar, and I think that's a good change to have made to Geese as a generality. You can also see the ending of it much more clearly. This does a good job of telegraphing that there are recovery frames, and keeping your mind on the idea that you could probably at least get into range instead of having to deal with them. Too far. Under most circumstances though, Ralph doesn't chase Shermie terribly well, so you can bet on Ralph approaches, attempt to catch or whiff punish them, and then escape because he won't reach you necessarily for much damage. Making this a much more defensive match than I'm used to playing, but still good. I can't get all the way over that. That move is not truly speaking a counter, but you can treat it as one because of the way her hurt box moves while it's happening. And like most things of that type, it won't bother people who just throw projectiles at you, because why would it? The rest is very precise spacing, as that move doesn't necessarily put you in front of or behind your opponent every time, but whip players sort of need to stand at the spot where it will. Of course, faking me out and waiting for me to do it will result in better situations, but then you're not really close enough to do anything. also relatively hard to hit Shermie while she's actually in the process of doing the move, with moves at the speed that Whip has. So while it's a bit cheap overall to just keep on doing that, it comes more so from the fact that my opponent needs to change strategy somewhat for it to help. That move is also functionally a counter, but only because it's invincible for a relatively longer time. I'm not sure if he actually retained that, but I don't remember having been hit out of it so far, so I just treat it the same. Also, I need this coat. Or rather, I have this coat, but it's slightly different. It doesn't have the cool moon thing on the back. Yeah, this hits Sahara today.
Nothing will stop this show.
Once you are relatively sure that you've had a good match, that you wouldn't necessarily need to fix anything, in these lounges we don't always actually rematch, so keep an eye on that. Just because your opponent has managed to get into a long match doesn't mean that it's going to be one for that long. Oh wait, I keep on forgetting to check what the light version of that feels like. Yeah, I think I could get more out of the light spin ball. Can't be absolutely sure why, but I'm going to assume it's shorter startup and more space control, or rather more spacing control from my end, which I obviously appreciate.
Round 2. Ready? Go!
Yeah, there we go. That's definitely countered. Very countered. Now here's a complicated matchup. Robert has so many ways of attacking Geese that actually Geese can't just ignore, compared to many other characters that Geese does just ignore. But Robert also doesn't have a lot of good solutions to the Rapukin, so it's hard to say what exactly will happen. Okay, I suppose that's a solution. I believe they also changed Geese's counter to just be more effective against everything, which is kind of weird. Don't even know what that was. Why do I have that? I'm not complaining, but I think you please. Saw it coming, but wasn't ready in time. Did I get it? Oh, no, that's I have a command grab. Why are you all doing this to me, these games? Why does my character have a command grab? I have so much to learn now about this. Here I was thinking I was just going to play standard Geese Howard. I'm sure this is standard Geese Howard in some game, but I'm like old school, so I have not played this character really long. Because Geese is generally not in main series games as often anymore. I deserve that. The fact that there is a gap in there is always so jarring to me. Oh. I always forget that part too. That would have been very epic had my opponent chosen the exact same height and strength of uppercut, but not so this time. Well, I will assume that that move that I did must have a light version too, and I'll treat that effectively the same as light spinfall. That said, approaching Joe very directly isn't one of Barry's best options because Joe has good shields that he can put up. So you have to convince Joe to not do that first. And she doesn't have a lot of great moves for doing that. But you can sometimes convince Joe to put up the wrong shield, though this is hard. But it does seem that light spinfall helps quite a lot as you fight from closer and therefore the spacing is easier to convince your opponent that you want to get really close to them. When, you know, obviously to sometimes actually use it and just waltz right up to them. It's easier on Robert who can just beat the move outright. But even Robert has to worry about certain aspects of it. Specifically the fact that he doesn't always do a lot of damage when he's playing that way. Mary's another one of those characters who's good at going through projectiles in lots of forms, so I tend to just ignore them a lot of the time. The fact that, in general, sweep can be used in this game as a standard button, you just hit it when you feel like it with punish with it, honestly informs a lot of the ways that people play KOF when they're not trying to get max damage. But as actually controlling the situation isn't really helped most of the time by just hitting sweep, and it's one of your most whiff punishable and therefore easily beaten moves if your spacing is bad, then you have to worry a lot. Right, so that, I guess I can treat that the same? Yeah. Noxy 131, huh?
Select members.
Going along.
Select order. Campaign. Select stage. It's about to be a party up in here!
Are you ready?
Round one. Ready? Go!
Alright, let's see what I can work out from this player's style. Yes, we got the hop back, the very low damage. I'm going to keep on jumping like that because, honestly, if you look at the amount of damage that K-Dash does in most situations, you really don't have to care about it. He's super good at stopping you from doing things, but he has to do it for so long that it's kind of depressing. That means that normally he's better once he has enough meter to do more damage off of the things he does. But telegraphing that against Mary makes life even harder. You can block her out of it, of course, but you don't actually care from Mary's side. Such a wonderfully evasive character, but in the end, it's not necessarily going to pay off if you don't have the damage. And that hard commit means that, yeah, just by luck alone, I guess, I ended up in a good matchup.
Are you ready?
But the mirror match is a different matter altogether because you will have to understand everything about this spacing to make any sense out of the match. You can burn a lot of meter on that, but oddly, please note that also doesn't do much damage. Still, burning the meter to get through that segment and bring Mary down was probably a good decision because she's not really a meter hungry character. And still having a whole meter left means everything's set up for you already. better to advance against her than not, but I'm not sure what the range I want to do this from with Geese is. I feel that the heavy is probably better. EX doesn't seem to do anything useful. Worth it. Totally good idea. From their side, I meant. And then both go into the air, and the test is that Geese wins. I expected Geese to win. In fact, I expect Geese to win every time because hers relies on you actually being grabbable on the ground. So you can use it as protection. That one I didn't expect as much. Generally, Geese doesn't get in on Mai terribly well, as you can see there. Even like moves that are meant to help you do that don't really get you far. And that move is nice and ambiguous. Iori doesn't necessarily fare all that well either, because Mai can fight from too far away for most of Iori's main strategies to work. You tend to telegraph too much. If you can get close to her and stay there, it's usually better. But she'll just knock you off, and that's a problem. One of your better bets is to not try all that hard to catch her in the first place. Like, if she goes back, let her go, because even the damage she does this way isn't something that Iori necessarily cares about. But you don't have a lot of good options for attacking her unless your opponent isn't expecting certain things. I keep on using the ES for that when I should really just use the run. Okay, do you want the rematch? This was a little faster. Yes, you do. If I lose this one, I'm probably dropping to back, because it will basically be because my opponent adapted really fast. And it'd be better for everyone else to get a chance to fight them, rather than them just getting one match and then me rotating again. But I expect that they will adapt, and the fact that Geese is in second spot is great for me here, because Mary handles this matchup so much better. Even when like the opponent does adapt, it's just an easier matchup flatly than most other things. The pushback doesn't suit him. The spacings don't tend to suit him. And his damage. I know there must be more damage in here somewhere, but I do not know how you would get it. So to me this is like, this matchup is just bad, like proper bad. And while KOF is likely to have more of these than other games, I'm not used to matchups being this bad and fighting games these days. So I'm gonna hope that someone shows me definitely point Mary versus point K. How do you make this work? Neutral jumping is usually the answer to this sort of matchup if your opponent is very aggressive. I dropped it. If you're not sure what to do, if the spacing's bothering you in some way, she has good straight down attacks like that, and it can make it easier to deal with problems. Fortunately, getting through Mary with Mary now puts me back at a slightly advantaged to me matchup. With this much meter, it's definitely advantaged. because again, those diving heavy kicks from the air mess with a bunch of stuff that she wants to do. And you can just like straight dodge a bunch of stuff that Mai normally uses for her trickery. She's also not a very strong character against long-range meaties like this. She can use stuff, but it's not necessarily a great idea to try all that hard, because Mary normally just gets knocked off without you dealing much damage, and because the moves she's usually using are charge, if she gets knocked off, even if she's far away, you can't be sure that she won't just do Slicer again. So if your character is weak to Slicer, knocking Mary away from you is normally not what you want to do. She has all this room for startup. You have to decide, am I advancing or not? It's just, let's call it a bad time.
Select order. Select stage. Nothing will stop this show.
As we mentioned on a previous stream, Yashiro versus Mary is a bunch of, no, I'm kicking you now. So I'm not necessarily going to have much to say. This is just a brawl. They have strategic options they could use, but it all falls apart the moment they're like a kick distance away from each other. So since you have both players that don't like fighting from far away and using those strategic options, this is just going to be a brawl. I have no idea who will win it, and I have no idea what the strategy used will be.
Round one. Ready? Go!
See? Deep strategy. Much thinking was happening. This, on the other hand, is relatively cerebral. Ralph doesn't advance enough to make most of Mary's stuff work, and his attacks, his physical attacks, get him out of the way of almost all of her main strategies. So you end up playing a lot of neutral, based on the fact that her neutral buttons are pretty good for fighting Ralph as a whole. And Ralph, in turn, has to look out for them, figure out which one's about to happen, and then counter it. You can throw in the occasional spin fall if your opponent is too far away from you and you think they're actually going to not charge or do a move. But in all, it's basically check my approach to the game, because Mary doesn't really have the option to not approach. She has the options to approach technically very specifically, but if you want to do damage to people, she has to go at them. Geese does not have to go at them. Well, that was where that move went. I have no idea why that doesn't hit there. I don't think it's definitely not a parry, so I have no idea. Over the head you go. Whip is hard because even though Geese could manage to get Rapukin off, Rapukin actually takes fairly long to start up if you didn't know. But the only reason it really works is because no one wants to get near Geese in the first place. Yeah, that is always a problem too. Saving the leap for the end was probably the best thing.
それで格闘術と言い張るか。滑稽な踊りにしか見えんな。
With the goal being simply to get around the fact that she has good attacks there, but so many of them don't hit high enough. If your opponent is on defense mentally, you definitely don't want to do that because she will just whip you out of the air. But if you expect them to do offense, then you weave through it like you normally do.
Round 1. Ready?
Brawling time. Even when they aren't both point, this can be fairly brawl-ish. It's just that it ends faster because there's more meter to throw around. One of the rarely seen from me pressure combos. When people talk about pressure in games, they're talking about something that's very difficult to understand when you are trying to make the transition from beginner to mid. A lot of the time, the purpose of pressure is to change the block, stun, spacing that you're at, not to actually make your opponent stop blocking and get hit. That said, your opponent might stop blocking and get hit. So you have to be ready for that, but it's not necessarily that's the idea. Crunch. Too early. I don't think it actually works anyway because the way that Mary grabs you after that is not the best in my opinion. But back to the question of Geese's changes, or if you can call most of them changes. The simple fact that you now have longer animations, you could say, at the end of a parry to let you know that the parry has happened and that there are basically recovery frames that are long telegraphed. Because if you have just the animation of Geese slowly returning to neutral stance, that's hard to recognize. It's hard to see that. Whereas having Geese do a motion, even if he recovers from that motion fairly quickly, helps you understand, I have about this much time to attack you. I need a hop here. That is a command grab. Why did you give Geese Howard a metered command grab? I don't know.
私の右に出る格闘家など存在し得ぬのだ。それが真理なのだよ。
Select members.
Before you arrive.
Select order.
俺の拳が嵐を呼ぶぜ。
Select stage. Nothing will stop this show.
One of the main things you will get a lot more online than you'll get from me is Geese's left-right mix-up. It's not very easy to understand Geese's left-right mix-up because it's a hop mix-up cross-up from close on a knockdown.
You.
しゃあ行くぜ。
Against Joe, you normally care more about your jumping blowback attack, but the spacing and timing for that is a little hard. It will, however, stuff a bunch of stuff Joe wants to do in neutral, and therefore you have to care about it. It also lateralizes? What are you doing, Brain? It also makes Geese lay flat in the air as a jump attack long enough to get over more things that Joe does as a whole. This basically is a cross-up. And it's not necessarily a cross-up where your opponent will get comboed after it, but because you can't necessarily tell which side Geese is going to be on when he does it, you are going to get caught a lot. Especially since he's the type that can just empty jump and then, like, grab you. Remember, there's chip damage in this game. It takes a while to actually chip you out, of course, but you still have to care. And since Geese has basically no counter for it other than really precise timing, you might just want to go for the offense, because your opponent might not be thinking you're going to bother. There's a demonstration as what I was talking about before relative to whip. This spacing is really precise. Shermie doesn't actually always go to the other side of you. Shermie goes to the other side of you when you were at the spacing for her to do that. Do I need to do this? No, I don't. And as usual, the game has done a good job of making sure that if you use super in a kill combo after the opponent's already dead, you don't actually lose the meter. This is much harder because the way that Kyo's attacks interact with Shermie's like drop back counter is probably not what you might expect. And she benefits so much more from getting close to this character, but can't make sure that that's where she ends up relative to the stuff he does. Expecting Kyo to come in close to you is a fool's errand because he will almost always have perfect spacing so that he doesn't have to stay there when he does his attack. Crossing him up at the last moment is probably your best bet. But there you go, see? Unlike Robert, where I could do that all day, I'm just going to whiff. KOF is the game that mostly teaches you to think about fighting games in that way. How do I get out of the way of this? And which of my opponent's moves will get them out of the way of my moves? This move is good or bad for this matchup because the movements involved in the matchup make it good or bad, not because the frame data says this move is good to use. It's not a question of, is my opponent blocking or not blocking? Your opponent is probably moving, and depending on how they're moving, you have to decide which move to use. Even static characters who don't move much in this game tend to have relatively large hitboxes that act as good shields against things. And then you have to think of, how am I going to outmaneuver this shield?
Round one. Ready? Go!
See? In fact, from my perspective, this entire match is me thinking about, how do I outmaneuver my opponent's shield, and what makes me think that their shield is actually going to happen. That, for example, was an attempt to cause the rising knee to whiff, and I've learned, no, that's a little too far forward. Geese hangs in the air before striking, unlike Mary, who doesn't extend her hurt box that far to begin with. So I can't use that there. See? Left, right. Geese actually jumps really far for such a relatively bulky character, so you end up with the bison problem. You don't necessarily think that this is going to cause you stress, but it's a large part of matchups. Because he's also one of those characters who takes a long time to start his projectile, but doesn't take long to recover after releasing it, rolling through them is difficult. So defenses really help. I've had years to learn the spacing for Repukins, so it's kind of rough for others, but I suppose fighting me is the easiest way to get to that experience. You generally have to stand a little closer to Geese than you'd expect to, because he tends to pull back his hurt box so much when doing things. So you always end up slightly short of what you expect, particularly because he does it during Repukin. There we go. This is usually the best way to play this matchup. You can't be sure that you'll get Shermie every time because she might bet on something, but staying at approximately that range and just powering through with punches makes it harder for her to do this sort of nonsense to you. Basically protects you from that move altogether. And taking her sweep a couple times, pretty irrelevant. Her normals don't work terribly well in that space either against a character who has any armor on their attacks or slows the movement of the advance. This matchup used to be a lot quote-unquote fairer back when we had the obvious these two being almost like reflections of each other. Basically back when Kyo had a fireball. That was basically the same fireball. Ground Spark. Do we actually call them something different in KOF? I don't think we do. I'm dropping this one, I think. So on to next. We will see if Grand Serpent will have any specific plans for fighting these characters. Bearing in mind, once again, that it's another situation where, assuming they choose the same team, it's not too hard to deal with. But they appear to be choosing relatively slower, so there might be some changes in team. Yashiro is basically another character who gets to bully Kei in neutral a bit more, but Yashiro will at least have to come forward directly instead of going through, under, and over things. Okay, no, that's more of a expectation in change. Because, yeah, it's not a great idea to just do that. Because presumably this player has already seen that her point is Yashiro, and playing K-Dash versus Yashiro is not great. So we're back to brawling. We did definitely see that their choice of how to play Mary is relying a lot on her grab, which is kind of hard to knock people out of. I think I wouldn't call it invincible, but the way that it interacts with most strikes is in Mary's favor. But Yashiro is the one who can mostly kick her out of that. And again, once you're really close, Yashiro has lots of reasons to just punch. So I expect, even if they have a tactic that's based around using that move and staying at longer ranges, it's still going to turn into a brawl eventually, because Yashiro also doesn't stand at the spacing where the move just works. He doesn't need to. He has reach enough from all his stuff where he can do other things. Generally, you can feel free to go ahead and rush at Mary a lot with Yashiro if your spacing is right. If you find yourself decently far away, rushing at her is not particularly dangerous. And rolling past her is also not terribly dangerous because the opponent would have to be on defense fairly hard for that to be a problem. In fact, technically, the more defensive and slow your opponent is playing as Mary, the more reason for you to roll with Yashiro. Wait, they gave me a taser? I didn't know about the taser. I should pay more attention. That spacing is the one you want to be at less, because Yashiro's moves will reach, but they're more so a commitment, and most of the time the Mary player will be pushing at that point. Ralph has it easier because, as mentioned, he gets out of the way of Mary's stuff way better most of the time, by just not being on the ground or not caring much. And he does a lot more damage in the situations where we're talking about. He also has that crouch heavy punch, which is generally stronger at stopping her from doing things at closer ranges by hitting her before she gets much into it. You have to be pretty good with your aim to play Mary for a long period. And whenever your aim messes up against Ralph, you take much more damage. Mai has a very similar experience with Ralph, except that he doesn't actually get to go in on her as much. Your general hope when you're playing Ralph is not to try to hit where Mai is. Generally, you should just hit where Mai might be in a little bit, because this drastically reduces the damage she'll do. So if you think that she would want to get into the air, aim at where you expect her to land. If you think that she is going to try to hang in the air or fly around, aim at the air. He doesn't have a lot of options for this, and hope for the best, more or less. Other than that, you can just roll out of a ton of things. The other side of that is, punishes matter a lot. But Ralph has great punishes, so there's not really a lot to worry about there either. The key is to stay mobile enough that your opponent can't spend time making their spacing for attacks perfect. And Billy is just another iteration of the same thing. The opponent wants to stand at spaces that make their positioning perfect so you can't punish them. But Ralph should mostly just power through it and just accept if things don't go well. The Ralph kick is a good way to do that a lot of the time. Whiff punishing like that is another good way. Just punch through as best you can. The better your opponent is, the harder this will be to do, but it doesn't really mean that you should change the style or the matchup. It doesn't really come up because Ralph doesn't have a ton of other options. This matchup, on the other hand, is kind of silly. Billy benefits from jumping, but he only really benefits from jumping, in my opinion, because he can then play a grounded game so much. Whereas Whip can just do that thing where she goes up into the air and drops down on your head, and he has nearly no answers to this move. When he has meter, he's got some answers, but mostly, yeah, you just like flip up into the air and get out of the way. His benefit is that her meter doesn't really help her a lot in this matchup. She was going to hit with most of these things anyway, and she doesn't do a lot of additional damage for doing them, so... But you also have to fear Billy with meter, which is presumably why this person chose to put them in the anchor position. Our very slightly late start means that this is the last on-stream match of the night. I think this lounge might stay a bit open for a little longer, at least until this person leaves. If someone else joins, it might stay open even longer than that. Part of the reason why it's so easy, let's say, to roll against Mary is because she has the same problem as Shermie does in certain situations. Her moves are very, very forward, which means that if you roll, the chances that she is in neutral range, like hitting normal's range, if she did a move, is extremely unlikely. That's a good way to think of a lot of characters in this game. If the person's move advances them a lot, you rolling through it as a dodge is a straight up dodge. You will end up so far away from them that if you have longer reach on your own character, it's beneficial to you to just get to the other side. If you are wrong about whether or not they were going to do that, a lot of the time you don't take that much damage because that's not where the character's damage comes from. If their damage comes from their specials, and their specials all advance them quite a lot, it's much less likely that just ending up on the other side of them when they did nothing is going to be really a problem. I have no idea whether or not Yashiro can armor through that. I would assume he can, but it's kind of difficult to deal with regardless. He does hit above though, so there's not as much difficulty or stress in just trying to use it. If you see Mai over your head like that, yeah, just punch. She can make you miss, but she can't keep that up for long enough that you necessarily care. But we're back to Ralph and just staying just mobile enough that she can't do as she likes. One of the things we've been teaching people about this game is that whereas you think of EX moves as a source of advantage or damage sometimes in other games, in this game they're mostly punishes. They start up faster and they tend to have invulnerabilities that lets you go through or counter your opponent's stuff. As you can see here, for example, this matchup gets really long and relatively slow because if Ralph stays mobile, Mai basically can't do that much. especially not with low meter, and she takes quite a long time to build it up for some reason, and often tends to have to use it to prevent Ralph from getting into good attack positions. The big disadvantage being that Ralph doesn't necessarily have a great anti-air game under normal circumstances, so she gets to spend a lot of time in the air. One thing that you can do, obviously, is air to air, and I think he does this with Light Punch. And depending on what she's doing, because she actually can't change her trajectory that much all of the time, you could probably set up a really strong Galactica Phantom. That move, however, is going to be the savior of this matchup and the next, simply because even though those characters can be ready to block it, to get away from it, whatever, they can't attack at the same time. Basically, just the risk that Whip will do that is effectively going, yeah, I can't do anything now. Whip does have a lot of problems though, because again, Mai will never stay still, so you can't ever attack where she is, and Whip's moves are relatively slower, meaning she spends much more time to attack where the person is, guaranteeing basically that you're going to miss, because Mai will not be there when you actually strike. But here we go again. Billy has enough meter to make this fairly short, because even though she can now do the whole in the air flip thing, right, he can play defensively entirely now instead of actually having to play offense at all. But playing completely defensively against Whip is another point where you just, like, adapt around it. She has a lot more freedom against defensive Billy than offensive Billy as a generality. And you see it demonstrated here. Of course, it's still a long haul, and he did end up using up all the meters, so that's pretty much a sign of it. But that, I believe, brings us to the end of our stream for today. You can find all of our bots at 2-mk.org, and information on streams on our Twitter 2_mk_FGC. New releases of bots are coming. We have been able to get some easy to input bots for this game, so you may be able to expect those within the upcoming weeks depending on what we need to do after Combo Breaker. Those who are there, good luck, may your combos not drop. This has been Willian for Team 2MK. Good luck with your training and good night everyone.